Hello and welcome to the old Fliers. Riding piggyback is fun if you are a child. In an aeroplane, not so much. During World War II, there were two Avro Ansons on a training flight that came together unexpectedly. The crew in the lower Anson parachuted to safety, whereas the pilot in the upper Anson, Graham Fuller, realised he could control both aircraft, so he did. So, deliberately flying two aircraft as one, we can say is a bit unusual. Like this one. The Space Shuttle Atlantis had returned from space, landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. It needed to be transported to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, 4,000 kilometers away. There it will be processed and repaired before launching again after about 120 days. Transporting such a massive piece of equipment by rail, road or by ship was ruled out. It just so happens that a Boeing 747 can haul 140 tons, so making it feasible to carry the 78 tons of Atlantis. The limiting factor was fuel. A gallon of fuel just to fly the length of a Boeing 747's fuselage. That meant a refueling stop at Biggs Army Airfield near El Paso, Texas, then one at Columbus Air Force Base in Mississippi before arriving in Florida. The pilot who flew the Boeing 747-shuttle combination from Columbus to Florida tells the story. He said, "Seeing that thing on top of an already overly huge aircraft boggles my mind. The whole mission from takeoff to engine shutdown was unlike anything I had ever done. We took off from Columbus Air Force Base on their 12,000-foot runway, of which I used 11,999 feet to get the wheels off the ground. We were at 3,500 feet left to go of the runway, throttles full power, nose wheels still hugging the ground, co-pilot calling out decision speeds, the weight of Atlantis now screaming through my fingers, clenched tightly on the controls, tyres heating up to their near maximum temperature from the speed and the weight, and not yet at rotation speed, the speed at which I would be pulling on the controls to get the nose to rise. I just could not wait, and I mean I could not wait, and started pulling early. If I had waited until rotation speed, we would not have rotated enough to get airborne by the end of the runway. So I pulled on the controls early and started our rotation to the takeoff attitude. The wheels finally lifted off as we passed over the stripe markings at the end of the runway, and my next hurdle, physically, was a line of trees 1,000 feet off the departure end of runway 16. All I knew was we were flying, and so I directed the gear to be retracted and the flaps to be moved from flaps 20 to flaps 10 as I pulled even harder on the controls. I must say, those trees were beginning to look a lot like those brushes in the drive-through car washes as I pulled even harder. Yet, I think I saw a bird just fold its wings and fall out of a tree as if to say, "Oh, take me." Okay, we cleared the trees, but it was way too close for my laundry. As we started to actually climb at only 100 feet per minute, I smelled something that reminded me of touring the Heineken brewery in Europe. I said, "Is that a skunk I smell?" And the veterans of shuttle carrying looked at me and smiled and said, "Tyres." I said, "Tyres? Ours?" They smiled and shook their heads as if to call their captain an amateur. Okay, at that point I was. The tyres were so hot you could smell them from the cockpit. My mind could not get over from this point on that this was something I had never experienced. The flight down to Florida took an eternity. We cruised at 250 knots indicated, giving us about 315 knots of ground speed at 15,000 feet. The miles didn't click by like I'm used to them clicking by in a fighter at Mach 0.94. We were burning fuel at a rate of 40,000 pounds per hour. The vibration in the cockpit was mild compared to down below and to the rear of the fuselage, and the noise was deafening. The 747 flies with its nose 5 degrees up in the air to stay level, and when you bank, it feels like the shuttle is trying to say, "Hey, let's roll completely over on our back." Not a good thing, I kept telling myself. So I limited my bank angle to 15 degrees And even though a 180-degree of course change took a full zip code to complete, it was the safe way to turn the monster. Airliners and even a flight of 2 F-16s deviated from their flight plans to catch a glimpse of us along the way. We dodged what was in reality very few clouds and storms, despite what everyone thought, and arrived in Florida with 51,000 pounds of fuel, too much to land with. We can't land heavier than 600,000 pounds total weight, and so we had to do something with that fuel. I had an idea. Let's fly low and slow and show this beast off to all the taxpayers in Florida lucky enough to be outside on that Tuesday afternoon. So at Ormond Beach, we let down to 1,000 feet above ground and flew just east of the beach out over the water. Once we reached the NASA airspace of the Kennedy Space Center, we cut over to the Banana Indian Rivers and flew down the middle of them to show the people of Titusville, Port St. John's and Melbourne just what a 747 with the shuttle on looked like. We stayed at 1,000 feet, and since we were dragging our flaps at flaps 5, our speed was down to around 190 to 210 knots. After reaching Vero Beach, we turned north to follow the coastline back up to the shuttle landing facility. There was not one person laying on the beach. They were all standing and waving. All this time, I was bugging the engineers, all 3 of them, to recompute our fuel and tell me when it was time to land. They kept saying, "Not yet, keep showing this thing off," which was not a bad thing to be doing. However, all this time, the thought that the landing, the muscling of this 600,000 pound beast was getting closer and closer to my reality. We got back to the SLF and were still 10,000 pounds too heavy to land. So I said I was going to do a slow approach over the SLF going the opposite direction of the landing. We got back to the SLF and were still 10,000 pounds too heavy to land. So I said I was going to do a low approach over the SLF going the opposite direction of landing traffic that day. At 300 feet, we flew down the runway, rocking our wings like a whale rolling on its side to say hello to the people looking on. One turn out of traffic and back to the runway to land, still 3,000 pounds over gross weight limit. But the engineers agreed that if the landing was smooth, there would be no problem. We landed at 603,000 pounds and very smoothly, if I have to say so myself. The 747 falls like a rock with the orbiter on it if you pull the throttles off the normal point in a landing, and secondly, if you thought you could hold the nose off the ground after the mains touchdown, think again. It is coming down. So I flew it down to the ground and then we had to park up. The shuttle had very hazardous chemicals on board and so had to be sniffed to determine if any had leaked out or were leaking. They checked for monomethylhydrazine and nitrotetroxide. Though we were clean, it took way too long for them to tow us into the mate-demate area. It felt good to bring Atlantis home in one piece after she had worked so hard getting to the Hubble Space Telescope and back. End of quote. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And even better, support our work by donating just $1.